is your first time to a Science Cafe? Awesome! Well, if you are not already following us, we do have a Facebook page, or you can Google New Bedford Science Cafe. It will take you right to our website where you can sign up to get emails. We have monthly talks here at Last Round, so please join us. And I'll tell you a little bit more about next month when we're done tonight. My name is Carrie. I work for Mass Audubon here in the Southeast region, and I'm very excited to be joined tonight by one of my colleagues, Dr. Grady. If you are not familiar with this space, we are at the Last Round, which is not open on Tuesdays, so please thank your waiters and bar staff, tip well, order some things, thank them for being here tonight. And please be patient with them. They're not used to having so many people here, I don't think. So, but the food is delicious, the drinks are refreshing, so please order up. So tonight is one of my favorite topics. I am a huge fan of horseshoe crabs. It's one of my favorite things to come across on the beach. I've been learning a lot about them recently and some of the things that are happening to them, and who better to talk about it than Dr. Grady. Sara started her academic career just west of the I-95 at Brown University, and then attended Boston University's marine program in Woods Hole, where she studied horseshoe crab population dynamics and management on Cape Cod. That happens to be the topic of this evening's talk. She spent 18 years working for the Massachusetts Bay National Estuary Partnership and started working at Mass Audubon in September, where she is the senior coastal ecologist for the Ecological Restoration Program. She's joining us tonight from Plymouth, Massachusetts, where she enjoys spending time with her kiddos scouting and singing, which, from what I understand, we may be treated to a little horseshoe shanty tonight as well, because she is not only a scientist, but she's an amazing musician. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Grady. She's going to spend a little time with us, and then we will have plenty of time for all of your questions afterwards, so stay tuned for that. If you're having any trouble hearing, which I don't think is going to happen, just give us a little hand raise, and we'll make sure to hold the microphone close to our mouths. All right, have fun.
Hello, everybody. Am I loud enough? So, I'm really glad to speak and actually sing to all of you tonight. Like Carrie said, I've been working for Mass Audubon for just about 5 months, but I have been studying horseshoe crabs and doing various horseshoe crab related things now for about 24 years or so. They are one of my favorite creatures. And I'm going to be singing you a song about them. Really, it's 2 songs. And it all started actually on a dare, because my friend Courtney, who works for the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, invited me to their biodiversity symposium. And she said, "Will you please speak about horseshoe crabs?" I said, "Sure, no problem." And she said, "You know, it's a really casual environment. You can do whatever you want. Heck, you could even sing a sea shanty." And I said, "Do not threaten me with a good time. I'm going to write myself a horseshoe crab sea shanty." So I feel like there's, you know, a legacy that I need to kind of live up to here in New Bedford. Quite a place to be singing sea shanties. So I have to let you all know that I'm not like a shanty person per se, if you know what I mean. Like, I'm not in like a shanty club, or, you know, I'm not like a archival collector of sea shanties or anything like that. I just thought it would be a really fun format to contain a lot of information. So what I'm gonna do is sing a lot of information at you, and then we'll go back and kind of go through what I sang about, and I'll explain what I was saying, because it does go by a little fast. And I am going to use my papers, because like I said, there are a lot of words. All right, so here we go, everybody. Buckle up. Let me sip of water. All right. So to start quite broad, our friends in arthropod, exoskeleton and legs with joints. But despite their name, they're not a crab, they're not the same, and we split away at this point. The Chelicerata are a group you gotta see with their tiny claws. They use this pair as a way to tear their food and put it in their jaws. Myrostomata means mouth in the middle. As it walks along, it grinds, picking up some food that gets thoroughly chewed. Mostly small things it finds. Limulus, Polyphemus, Limulus. What about their kin? Limulus, cousins to spiders and scorpions. The horseshoe crab you've met is part of a quartet of species that exist. Another 3 in the clan: India, Japan, Southeast Asia, that's the list. And the Japanese, the crabs they believe, samurai in battle they did fall. Inspired Pokemon, Kabuto and Kabutops, you've gotta catch 'em all. Limulus, Polyphemus, Limulus. What's under that shell? Limulus, Polyphemus. Well, I'm just about to tell. They have 3 body parts, and their body starts with a prosoma in the front. The telson's in the back, but they don't attack you with it. It's quite blunt. Give our friend a flip, claws like scissors that can snip, and 10 armored walking legs. Layers of book gills, that spiky mouth that mills, and a vent for sperm and eggs. To tell the sex of the crabs is not complex once they reach maturity. The male gets boxer claws that are quite crucial because they hold female shells with ease. Limulus, Polyphemus, Limulus. That's a horseshoe crab. Limulus has those special claws so they can grab. Florida to Maine, there's something really plain. Mid-Atlantic crabs they grow. The largest on the shore, up to a foot or more. They're the biggest ones we know. In May and June, both at midnight and at noon, they come in shore to spawn. It is quite a sight to go to the beach at night and watch them carry on. A moon that's full or new brings a tide that's higher too, which the horseshoe crabs might prefer. Higher on the beach, their eggs are out of reach till the next spring tide occurs. Limulus, Polyphemus, Limulus. Mating on the shore, Limulus, Polyphemus. But wait, there is still more. Do the crabs get stuck on the beach? For sure, that's yucky for anyone that can smell. Sometimes what you find is a molt that's left behind. It's a crunchy, shed-off shell. When crabs of 2 sexes pair in amplexus, they wander 2 by 2. Male boxer claws latch on the female and attach him to her until they're through. The eggs are bluish-green, almost too small to be seen unless you're looking close. Buried underground, they aren't often found except by shorebirds and science pros. Limulus, Polyphemus, Limulus. The female's full of eggs, Limulus. By the end of the season, all that's left is dregs. After 2 weeks, that batch of eggs will finally hatch, releasing trilobite larvae. Check out their baby pics after molts 1 through 6. In a year, they start to stray. We don't see them much, they don't write, don't keep in touch for about the next decade. They're eating in the deep, no reason for them to keep near shore where it's less safe. Limulus, Polyphemus, Limulus. Why do we even care? Limulus, Polyphemus. Hang on, I'm about to share part 2. Part 2's coming. We're getting a little more somber now. All right, here we go. Oh. Oh, once in a time, not long ago, people did not like horseshoe crabs, you know, accused of eating all the clams on the shore of Barnstable County. The towns, they said, to kill them all, for horseshoe crabs, they took the fall, and people brought their tails to the town hall to get a bounty. It turns out that what they eat is worms and amphipods, what a treat. Maybe a clam or three, but really who could blame them? And now we have changed our mind, they're important for bird and humankind. We learn about our eyes by looking at what theirs can do. However, we have also found that they make the best bait around for catching whelks, and that is causing problems for them too. A shorebird called the red knot can fly so far, yes, quite a lot, from South America to the Arctic on their migration. On the way they stop to rest, they think that horseshoe crabs are best for bulking up and getting fat and reaching satiation. Feeding this little bird is very important. I'm sure you've heard how these two animals are strongly linked together. Their blood is blue. That's because of copper. It clots up as an infection stopper. This is the very quality that we wanted to claim. 1/3 of the blood inside a crab is extracted in a sterile lab and used to test all kinds of drugs, and that's their claim to fame. When you look at the horizon line, your eyes adjust so they refine the difference between dark and light edges with your vision. The horseshoe crab can do this too, an important skill for them, it's true. This clarity of borders is called lateral inhibition. 450 million years old, these crabs are worth their weight in gold, but even so they are still harvested for bait. The greatest source of mortality is the harvest for the whelk fishery. The crabs are gathered up and put in pieces in a bait bag. Some of them are caught by hand by people walking on the sand, while others are collected from a boat using a drag. With horseshoe crabs in coastal states, the government who regulates the number and the size of all the crabs that can be taken. And as we learn more, they adjust, but many feel it's still unjust to harvest any crabs at all. We must be mistaken. So now I've sung my song. I hope you learned as it went along. Now I would be quite glad to answer all your questions. La 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 la. All right, yeah, so that went by real fast. So what I'm gonna do now is just kind of go through the facts that are behind those various lines. So, they are called a horseshoe crab, but they are not a true crab. They are an arthropod, they have jointed legs, and they have an exoskeleton. But they're really more closely related to spiders and scorpions as a chelicerate. So they have these two little claws that are near their mouth, and that's what they use to kind of push food into their mouths. And you can see that if you ever wanted to get close enough to a spider or scorpion to look at their face, you might see those two little claws as well. They then are kind of separate from the spiders and scorpions. They have a mouth that's actually in the middle of their body. So if you were to flip a horseshoe crab over and look at those 10 legs, in the middle of those legs is kind of a spiky hole. And that spiky hole is their mouth, and they push food into that spiky mouth and walk along, and it kind of, it's not quite elbows, but it they're crab elbows. They kind of use them to grind up whatever food that they've put in there. There are actually 4 different species of horseshoe crabs around the world. Ours is Limulus polyphemus, which hopefully you now is burned into your brain. So yes, Limulus polyphemus. It is the only species in the genus Limulus. And then there are 3 other species that are all entirely in Asia. So there's an Indian horseshoe crab, a Japanese horseshoe crab, and one in Southeast Asia. They are very popular over there as well. Very similar sort of harvests for various things. They're a little bit more popular for maybe human food purposes. The eggs are actually used, are actually eaten. Kind of similar to how you might eat like tobiko on sushi or something like that. But they also were believed to be reincarnated samurai. Because it kind of their shell kind of looks like, if you're being creative, a samurai's helmet and a sword. And there are actually 2 Pokemon that are named after horseshoe crabs, Kabuto and Kabutops. And the gotta catch 'em all thing, like if you know Pokemon, that's like the thing that people say about, gotta catch 'em all. That body of theirs has 3 different parts. It has a front rounded part, which we call the prosoma. Then it has that sort of trapezoid section, which is the opistosoma. And then that very famous telson, that pointy tail. They are not trying to stab you. They're not trying to poison you. That tail is meant to help them flip over. If the waves flip them over, they're able to use that to kind of lever themselves back up and get on their way. They do have 10 legs under that shell, and all of the 10 legs, well, I shouldn't say all. So on a female horseshoe crab, the front 4 pairs, so the first 8 legs, all end in sort of scissor-shaped claws. And if you were to stick your finger in that claw, it can't really pinch you. They're really weak claws. It can pick up a little worm maybe from the mud, but it can't. It's not like a lobster or something that's going to really give your finger a pinch. The rear pair of claws, actually has kind of a flared panels, I would call them, that when they press into the mud, spread out. And that acts almost like ski poles or hiking poles to help them push in the mud. And the males, when they reach sexual maturity, their front scissor claws change into what are called boxer claws. So instead of having the scissors, they have a claw that kind of looks like this. It's like a rounded claw with a little hook. And that hook fits perfectly on the back of the female's shell. So when you see horseshoe crabs, you'll often see them in a pair. And that's because the horseshoe crab in the back is the male, the one in the front is the female. And just like a lid snaps onto, Tupperware, those claws snap onto the back of the female shell, and then he kind of helps her walk, but she kind of drags him around, and then goes to shore, lays her eggs in the sand, digs a little hole, lays the eggs, and then he's right there to fertilize those eggs. There are often also satellite males, which tend to hang around the periphery of a pair of horseshoe crabs. And they're also trying to fertilize the eggs. And they actually do surprisingly well with that, given that they're not right there. I think it's something like 40% success, so not bad. So if you're walking on the beach and you find a horseshoe crab, now you can amaze your friends by knowing whether it is a male or female. You can also be even more intrusive and flip over the first cover, or the cover on their book gills. So horseshoe crabs breathe through what are called book gills. They're very, very fine layers of tissue, just like the pages of a book. And as long as those book gills stay wet, the horseshoe crab is able to breathe. So it's able to absorb oxygen from its environment, which is how they can walk up onto the beach and be out of the water for a day or two, as long as those stay wet. And sometimes they will bury themselves in wet sand if they don't manage to get back out to the water. So if you see a horseshoe crab buried into the sand at low tide or something, or the mud, if you're not going to put it back in the water, don't dig it up, because it's trying to keep those book gills wet. But underneath that first layer of the book gills is actually where the sperm or eggs come out. So you can flip that up. They don't like it. It's like aggressive to do them, but you can see the females will have like a little vent where the eggs come out. And if she's really got a lot of eggs to lay, sometimes they'll even be coming out of her body. And the females really are just a box of eggs. Like it is like if you took a little round hat box with legs and you filled it with caviar and let it walk around. That's kind of what a female horseshoe crab is like. There's not much else in there. And their legs actually are kind of, they're almost like little like marionette legs too. So like there's like just one little tendon that comes up each leg to the middle, and then they just kind of like, if you pull on the little tendon, the leg will kind of kick. They're very hard to dissect, though. I wouldn't suggest it, because they're very hard to kill, surprisingly. When I was in grad school, we actually were studying how many eggs were in a given female, and we had to, unfortunately, dissect the horseshoe crab to get that information. And we were a good way through taking apart the horseshoe crab, and it started to walk away. So that was too bad. One of the things that, so you've got a big female, right? Up here, south of the Cape, the crabs are much bigger than on the north side of the Cape. So, and they get even bigger as you go further south. Has anyone been to like the Jersey Shore or Delaware Bay, or anyone? Have you seen the horseshoe crabs there? They're giant. I mean, they're huge compared to the ones we have up here. And there's actually, they increase as you go down. They start up in Maine, believe it or not. They are little, and they spawn on even like cobbly, rocky beaches up there. And then they get bigger and bigger and bigger as you go down toward the mid-Atlantic. And then they get smaller again as you get down into Florida and the Gulf of Mexico. So they start out as those little eggs that are buried in the sand, and they tend to try to lay the eggs on the spring tides, more so in the mid-Atlantic than here. So those high tides that happen with the full and the new moon. Up here, the pattern isn't quite as strong, but that way those eggs get laid, and they're generally not disturbed by water until they're able to hatch, which happens 2 weeks later. The trilobite larva is the first instar, the first molt of a horseshoe crab. And it looks just like a horseshoe crab, except it doesn't have a tail, it doesn't have a telson, because it's kind of bad news to have a little dagger attached to your body when you're living in an egg. So now once they've hatched out 2 weeks later, then they're like, okay, now I'll molt again, and I can get a nice pointy tail. And their spikes are very, very fresh when they're young. Has anyone ever touched a juvenile horseshoe crab? Yeah, they're sharp. They're very sharp. They're very pokey and sharp. And they kind of wander around randomly in the mud flats, and they're eating little bits of organic matter and worms and little amphipods, which are those little shrimpy things. And and then they molt multiple times. They molt 17 times throughout their lives. But after that first year, they pretty much disappear. So they've molted 6 times in that first year. They get to be about that big. And then they're like, bye, I'm not gonna see you for a decade. And they take off, and they're just eating in the deep water. And so when you see crabs coming in to spawn, those crabs are at least 12 years old, usually, which is why it's such a management concern, which we'll get to a little bit later, but they're an animal that produces a lot of offspring, but they live so long, they should really be managed by something that lives a long time, like a turtle. And that's how they can become threatened and things like that. So, and those eggs are blue-green. They're a lovely little sort of, almost like a slightly greener Tiffany blue would be the way I would describe it. So yeah, so they come back to spawn after those few years. Make sure I'm covering all the things I sang about. Now we'll talk a little bit about adult horseshoe crabs and what kind of has been going on with those crabs. That was kind of the ecology part of it, and I will get into the management part of it. So, horseshoe crabs were considered a menace. Nobody liked them. They were thought to be eating everybody's clams, and so they were just useless. Let's get rid of them. And the way that was solved was to offer a bounty for horseshoe crabs. So up until the late 60s, you could catch horseshoe crabs and just kind of break off the tail, the telson, and take it to the town hall in towns like Chatham and Orleans, and they would give you a bounty. I think it was like 4 or 5 cents per tail, and that wasn't just proving, oh hey, I found this horseshoe crab. I mentioned that the horseshoe crabs use that tail to flip themselves over. So it was pretty much just crippling the horseshoe crab and leaving it to the raccoons and the gulls. So I know, it's very sad, right? So it turns out that they don't eat a lot of clams. And we've done, one of the things that I worked on in grad school with another student was trying to figure out what they do eat. And they generally eat worms and little, like I said, little amphipods, little shrimpies, things like that. Little shrimpies is the scientific name for amphipods, by the way. So when you pick up a piece of seaweed and you're like, oh, it's covered with shrimpies. Those are amphipods. That's a little easier to say. Now we're kind of learning that horseshoe crabs maybe aren't so bad. Maybe they have some benefits. So the one that relates to ecology the most is that their eggs provide the primary source of food for a lot of migratory shorebirds, especially for the red knot, which is a little shorebird that migrates from Tierra del Fuego to the Arctic every spring, and they stop over in the mid-Atlantic and somewhat up here as well to eat those horseshoe crab eggs and just gain a ton of weight so that they can make that journey. And so those two animals are really tightly connected in terms of the timing that they're showing up at our beaches and the populations of both of those animals. Horseshoe crabs, we've discovered, have very valuable blood. That's something that people have often heard about horseshoe crabs. It's like one of the things people say, oh, horseshoe crabs, don't they have special blood? They do have special blood. Their blood, a compound in their blood really, is very, very, very sensitive to the presence of bacteria. So they will form a clot if anything even remotely gets inside their body. So it's called limulus amoebocyte lysate. And just a sip of water. And it was actually discovered in Woods Hole. And that compound can be isolated And that is what is happening when horseshoe crabs are being harvested for what we call the biomedical harvest. So there used to be one facility that did bleeding of crabs in Massachusetts. Now there are two. And what happens is someone goes out, a biomedical harvester who has a biomedical permit. There is a separate permit for biomedical harvest and for the bait harvest. They go out, they harvest the crabs, and they usually put them in kind of like a trash can. Just kind of stack them up on each other like a pile of bowls, like in your cabinet. And they go into the lab, and if you bend a horseshoe crab in half, there's a hinge between that front half, the prosoma, and the back half, the opistosoma, that has a membrane on it. And there's these racks, and the crabs get put in the racks kind of in a V shape, and that membrane on that hinge is right at the bottom of the V. And then everything has to stay sterile because, again, you can't introduce any bacteria because it will cause that blood to clot up. Put a needle in the crab and drain about 1/3 of the blood into a bottle, and then that can be extracted, and it's sold to test the sterility of anything that's injectable that goes into your body. So people, you're sure the COVID-19 vaccine, but even just your flu vaccine, or if you go and you get saline IVs, all been tested with horseshoe crab blood, or an extract of the horseshoe crab blood. Before that, the pharmaceutical companies had to inject whatever they were testing into a bunch of rabbits and wait for the rabbits to get a fever. It was called the rabbit pyrogen test. So it's a lot faster to use a little bit of powder that's gonna make a little gel and you know that it's contaminated versus waiting for your rabbit to get sick. So obviously a big discovery, but one that people get a little bit concerned about because we're finding that about 30% of the crabs harvested for that particular part of the harvest, the biomedical, don't make it through that whole process. Fortunately, it's a much smaller harvest than the other harvest, which is the bait harvest. So bait harvest, they are harvested for the whelk fishery, which, believe it or not, is actually a pretty major fishery for the state. Although it has become increasingly overfished. So there's a chance that both fisheries may kind of follow a downward trajectory together, which would be good for horseshoe crabs. If the whelk fishery kind of fell apart, then the horseshoe crab fishery for bait would also kind of fall apart. For that, the horseshoe crabs are just collected and cut into pieces and put in bait bags in the whelk trap, and that's kind of the end of that part of things. The bait bag does help. It helps the bait last longer. The problem is that the female crabs are the ones that are targeted by the bait fishery because the whelks really, really like the egg smell and the female blood. They're much more attracted to that. And the harvest generally occurs during that spawning period in the spring. So it's probably one of the only harvests of an organism that is female targeted and happens when the females are trying to spawn. So obviously that is a big problem because that's not great for populations to do that. It doesn't really allow them to be sustained. So there are a couple more facts I want to cover before I get back to that. No, we'll just keep talking about that. So the Division of Marine Fisheries is currently looking at the horseshoe crab regulations again. Last year, there was a proposal to stop the horseshoe crab fishery during the spawning season That got voted down by a commission, Marine Fisheries Commission. But there were some changes made to the fisheries regulations. So the second biomedical harvester showed up only a year or two ago. And so now there is actually a biomedical quota for the first time of 200,000 crabs a year split between the two companies. The bait harvest used to be 165,000 crabs, and it's been reduced to 140,000. But the new proposal is to prevent harvest during the spring, again. So, that which makes total sense. And the thing is, Massachusetts is one of the very few remaining states that allows that kind of harvest to happen, that female harvest during the spring. So there's a lot of incentive for the crabs to have as much support as possible for that proposal. And so at the end, Carrie has a little QR code and a website, oh, right there, here you go. So this is our advocacy moment through Mass Audubon. You can help. You can go to the Mass Audubon website and sign up to be a champion for the horseshoe crabs. And we'll let you know when there are things going on. Conveniently, you're located in a great place to go do comments in person at the Division of Marine Fisheries in New Bedford. So, so that's pretty much the story of conservation of horseshoe crabs. So there was one other thing that I kind of skipped over, 2 facts that I skipped over. So I'm just gonna kind of throw them out. Fact 1, their blood is blue. It's blue because it contains copper. Our blood, the oxygen carrying molecule is hemoglobin, and it is an iron-based molecule. Their blood is hemocyanin. It's a copper-based molecule. So what happens when iron rusts? It turns reddish. When copper oxidizes, it turns blue. And that's why their blood is blue. The other thing that I mentioned in my song is the lateral inhibition. And I'm gonna toot my own horn here. Let me see if I can find the right page. Yes, I rhymed vision with lateral inhibition. So I was pretty happy about that one. So lateral inhibition is kind of just a cool thing that our eyes can do and that horseshoe crab eyes can do too, where if you were to look at, say, the horizon, so you go to the beach, it's a nice clear day, you've got a bright sky, you've got a dark blue ocean, your eye darkens the dark blue and lightens the light blue right where they meet. So it makes the clarity of that line even sharper. And horseshoe crabs are the first creature evolutionarily whose eyes can do that too. Now why would this thing wandering around on the mud care about being able to see the difference between dark and light? Well, they're looking for dark objects on light backgrounds because they're looking to mate with each other. I will tell you though, they're not so great at it. I mean, their vision is not that awesome. They've got 2 compound eyes, and then they've got another 8 sort of photoreceptors. But they will definitely come and see what's exciting about your shoe if you're walking around in the water. They're like, oh, this looks like a pretty good thing to grab onto. They will grab onto rocks and things like that. So, I think that mostly covers it. I would love to answer your questions. Do you have more to say before I? Okay. Yes.
I understand that Associates of Cape Cod has a small breeding program. Because I saw a fellow at Woodneck Beach in Falmouth releasing small horseshoe crabs.
Yeah, so the question or the comment was that Associates of Cape Cod, which is one of the breeding facilities in Falmouth, has a horseshoe crab breeding program where they raise juvenile horseshoe crabs from eggs and then release those into the wild. That is definitely true. The unfortunate thing is that the impact that has on the population is pretty minimal because it's kind of, that's a lot of snacks you're just kind of throwing out onto the beach. Yes?
I had heard that it's not only the number that die, you said a third die or something that from that, but also that it retards breeding of the females.
Yeah, so the question is, or the comment, that not only do about 30% of bled crabs die, that they also have some behavioral changes due to that bleeding, and they do tend to be more lethargic, they tend to stay more, they don't tend to go into the beaches and spawn as much after they've been bled. So that is, yes, that is true. Yes?
I grew up in the city of Flint in the North Shore. When I was a kid, you couldn't walk on the Saugus River Beach because so many horseshoe crabs. Are the numbers still as prolific now as they were years ago?
An observation from the Saugus River that you couldn't walk on the beach without seeing thousands and thousands of horseshoe crabs. And many other people say that, that they remember going to the beach and there being lots and lots and lots of horseshoe crabs. And yes, there used to be a lot more horseshoe crabs in here. The problem is there's kind of a shifting baseline we have because nobody bothered to count them. Because we didn't care about them back then. So we don't really know how many there used to be. We just know there were more. We've been doing spawning surveys. I say we. I have been participating in the spawning surveys since about 2008, I think. And Mass Audubon has been participating in those out in Wellfleet for, I think, just about as long. And we've seen that in some places in Massachusetts that the populations have started to recover some, particularly in places where there's not as intense harvest per se, which makes sense. But the other problem is that a lot of the data that is being used to show that horseshoe crab populations are recovering and therefore we maybe don't need to be as worried, are coming from surveys that are happening south of Cape Cod. And that's where a majority of the state's harvest is from. It's like about 85%. But it's also where the crabs that are completely protected in the Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge and Cape Cod National Seashore live. So there's what we would call a source sink situation happening where there's healthy horseshoe crab populations that are untouched, and then they kind of walk across the harvest line and they get scooped up. So, and yeah.
There's two things you want us to do. What are they?
Thing number one would be, oh yes, I almost did it perfectly. What are two things you can do? Thing number one, you can sign the petition for Mass Audubon, right here, and advocate for the new regulations for horseshoe crabs. Thing number two you can do is in your own community, advocate for coastal practices that allow horseshoe crab spawning habitat to exist. So avoiding hard seawalls and things like that that cause depletion of sand and sediment, and ensuring that as the sea level rises, that the marshes and the mudflats can migrate landward. Yes.
Are there any natural, other than humans, natural predators?
Do horseshoe crabs have natural predators? Their main natural predators happen when they're on the land. That's where they're the most vulnerable. And it's things like gulls and raccoons that can get them when they're vulnerable. They can flip them over and eat them. Okay, let's see. Yes, in the blue.
So, awesome rhyming. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the compliment of my rhyming. Thank you.
But beyond that, the life cycle of the crabs that you're talking about, the 10 years at sea, how do we know that? And then also, is it a one and done kind of situation like the salmon, or do they keep coming back every year after 10 years to breed?
Okay, so there's two questions there. One is, how do we know that they go away for 10 years? Question number two is, can they spawn multiple years? So, question number one about how we know that they're gone for so long is that one of the things that I did for my dissertation was do non-spawning surveys. And so I went out and put a grid over Barnstable Harbor and Pleasant Bay and Stage Harbor, all on the Cape. And went now I wish I could remember, I think it was a 100-meter transect every 500 meters or something like that, and measured every horseshoe crab that I could find. And because they are an arthropod, they molt. And so as they molt, and as they're spawned into the system, it creates cohorts, so it creates these groupings by size. And so we know how big they are when they come in to lay their eggs, and we know how big the ones are that are close to the beach and when those cohorts show up. So we know that those are the ages and how long it takes for them to get a certain size. They can come back year after year. In fact, we tagged horseshoe crabs that come back to the exact same mud flat year after year. They have their favorite spots, it seems. And they'll also spawn multiple times within a season. So a female will lay kind of a clutch of 2,000 to 3,000 eggs and then meander away and come back and lay another clutch of eggs. So they have multiple nests per season too. Because a female can have up to about 200,000 eggs inside. Like I said, it's a hat box full of eggs. Yeah, so, yeah. All right, let's see. There was someone over here. Did you still have a question?
I was going to say, they're out there for 10 years, but something you just said is that they come back. So they get to the ocean, they're out there for 10 years, they come back, lay their eggs. Then they go back to sea and come back the next year, or is it another?
So I was asking if they go all the way out to sea and then come back each year after that 10-year gap. And they don't really go out to sea. They just go into deeper water. So they're not near the beach.
So that's why they're so easily lost.
Yes, yeah, because you can catch them on the beach while they're spawning, or you can also go out with a drag and just drag them up. And there is a size limit, thank God, because one of the things that is when they're most vulnerable is actually right before they become mature. And that's due to just some of the math of population dynamics. It's kind of, a teenage any animal has the most future potential to contribute to the population in terms of the amount of offspring it can have. So if you take something out of the system before it's had a chance to lay eggs or have children, then you've lost that population growth potential. Okay, yes, way back.
Question about the effect of climate change. Are we likely to start seeing larger horseshoe crabs as warming waters and so forth move up further north?
So the question is, will we start seeing larger horseshoe crabs as temperatures warm? I think based on some of the other things that we've seen with coastal invertebrates that have been happening, they've been having a range shift. So there may be a point at which those larger south of the Cape crabs are showing up north of the Cape, but they're not growing bigger necessarily. It's just that they're the populations that already would be big are further north. Yes, right there.
This one I don't know about at all, but are there sex shifts in horseshoe crab? I mean, if they take the blood out, are they more likely to stay male or something?
So the question is, do they change sex at all, particularly if they're bled? And the answer is no, they don't. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Just wondering what the whelk harvest is used for.
What is the whelk harvest used for? The whelk harvest is an export harvest. So it is eaten. We just don't eat a lot of them here. It's not a big market for us, but it is big in other places. Yeah. Yes.
There's interesting chatter in the mainstream media about artificial horseshoe crab blood. Is it blather that we should ignore? Is it meaningful? Will it diminish the harvest for medical purposes?
So the question was, what about the artificial bait, right? Or the artificial biomedical stuff, yeah. So that is apparently effective. There's a lot of red tape that's kind of holding that back right now. The issue is that, I mean, it would help, but really the issue for us, at least in Massachusetts, is that the bait harvest has a much bigger impact on their populations than the biomedical harvest, because it's a percentage of a smaller harvest versus being 100% of a larger harvest. Yes?
As we living on the Cape and we keep losing our beaches and stuff like that, is there a concern or is there evidence that rising seas are affecting where, how far, or do horseshoe crabs know I gotta go, 10 yards further in or not?
So the question is, how is sea level rise affecting the beach access in places where we're losing beaches? And the answer is yes, it does affect the available spawning habitat. They will spawn in what I would call the near subtidal, or really, it's not the subtidal because it is the intertidal. So at high tide, they will spawn below the high tide line. They'll spawn on sandbars and things like that. But losing that upper beach habitat is a problem, especially in places where the sand and the places for the eggs to be buried are lost. Yes?
Question about their feedings. The eyes are in the top front of the carapace, if we can call it that, and the stomach is on the underside. How can they manipulate, or do they have feelers that are intelligent enough to decide into this is a arthropod or this is a worm? How do they, in that scene, we put the food in our mouth. We have that. How can they do that if one is on the other side of their body?
So the question is, how can they eat on the bottom of their body if their eyes are on the top of their body? So I would say that everything that's happening on the bottom of their body is a lot of like chemosensory kind of thing. They're smelling the things that are in the mud and digging them up. The eyes are really for seeing each other, I would say. Yeah, for finding mates.
Manta rays and stingrays
Yeah.
have eyes on top of the mouth.
Yeah, they suck the food up from the, manta rays. I'm gonna look over, oh, yes.
Are there any local beaches where spawning occurs, meaning here in Bedford, Massachusetts, or where the sources?
That is a really good question. The question is, where are there local beaches that horseshoe crabs spawn? I mean, local to here, to this part of the South Coast. I think Swift's Beach is somewhere near here. Yeah, Wareham, yep. So there's a place that at least horseshoe crab spawning surveys happen. I think also Gray's Beach, possibly, which is in Bourne, I think. I did my spawning surveys in Duxbury Beach, so I was on the South Shore, not the South Coast. But there are some nice horseshoe crabs up there. They're a little bit littler, but they're very good crabs. I like them. Let's see. One more question. Yeah, right there. Yeah.
So when I see a shell on the beach, they're not dead. They've molded.
So the question is, when I see a shell on the beach, they're not dead. They've molted. The key to telling the difference is if it is very thin and crunchy and feels kind of like plastic, that's a molt. If it's heavy and dark and stinky, that's a dead marsh. Dead marsh. I'm also a salt marsh ecologist. That's a dead horseshoe crab. Yeah. And one cool thing about their molting is that they're one of the few arthropods that molts forward. So if you've ever found, like a cicada molt, they molt kind of they molt like almost on like their back, right? They kind of back out of that molt. Horseshoe crabs, the whole front of the prosoma splits open, and then they just kind of walk right out of it. And if you find a molt, it's intact. It's got all the book gills, it's got the eyes, so it does really look like an entire horseshoe crab. All right. Oh, one more. Okay. Yeah.
On Barnstable Harbor, you could often see a female with multiple males grabbing onto the back. What advantage are these satellites? Why did they do it?
So the question is, why are the satellite males there? Only one of the males actually is locked on to her shell. The other ones are just kind of piling on, and what they get is an opportunity to contribute their genetics to the eggs that are being laid. They're taking a chance. And that's a good note to end on. Careful you don't trip.
I promised you were going to have a little bit of fun tonight, and I hope that rang true. I didn't know I was going to memorize the scientific name of a horseshoe crab by Shanty, but here we are. I will never leave my brain again, so thank you. And every time I think I've learned everything I can learn, I learn 15 new things. So I hope you all walk away having learned some things, and I hope you all walk away as advocates for horseshoe crabs, which is what Sara was saying. One of the 3 main focuses of the advocacy department of Mass Audubon right now is that legislation for horseshoe crabs. So I will be up here, I'll leave this up here, there's a QR code, but you can also just Google Mass Audubon horseshoe crabs and find us pretty easily. If you sign up for this, we'll send you action things that we need people to get out and do. So sometimes it's writing a letter, sometimes it's showing up somewhere. So for example, the group that shot this legislation down was a very small group that had a public meeting in Fall River, but nobody knew about it or knew to go there. So we might send out an email to people who live in that radius and say, hey, can you show up at this place and advocate for horseshoe crabs? So we really need everyone's voices. So we would ask that you think about that, and maybe as a second step, tell a friend something you learned about horseshoe crabs and have them sign up as well. For those of you who are new here and our old friends, a reminder, we will be back on March 5th for our next New Bedford Science Cafe. That will be a really interesting topic. We're going to have science writer Maggie Jackson here to discuss her latest book, Uncertain, The Wisdom and Wonder of Being Unsure. So I hope you will join us on March 5th. I hope you will stick around. If you have questions, I'm sure Sara will stick around to answer them. And we have a person in the back. I've already forgotten their name, but if you'd like to come forward and just tell us a quick bit about your what you're here to talk about, so we can make sure to visit you while we're lingering and having a last drink, that would be great. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Grady, for being here. So grateful to work with such amazing people.
Hi, everyone. My name's Rachel. I work with the City of New Bedford in the Department of City Planning. And I am the department's point person for our focus team on the hazard mitigation plan update. So that's a fancy way of saying that the city is working really hard to get some public feedback on what we need to address in the City of New Bedford in the coming years to be able to handle the effects of climate change. So if you're experiencing flooding, if you're experiencing increased costs of heating and cooling in your energy bill, we want to know about it. So there is a board in the back near Bob. Thank you, Bob. And we have some dots. If you have 30 seconds to a minute, feel free to put some dots on some areas of concern. If you have a little more time, specifically 10 minutes, you can scan the QR code on the chart, and that'll bring you to our community survey. And we really appreciate every response that we get. We want to get as much feedback from the people who are, living through these problems as they progress and worsen, so that way we can better adapt to the challenges we have ahead. So thank you very much for your consideration.
I know it's good.